hello everybody. This is going to be the final part 6 for Unit 1 of AP Psychology. Today we're going to be looking at ethics in research, right? And again, this is going to wrap up our scientific foundations of psychology here. So ethics in research. So there's kind of a few specific points that are just kind of looking about this and talking about this in general. So the biggest thing is that we want to make sure that any research we do is done in an ethical way, right? We want to make sure that we are following kind of these moral guidelines. So the American Psychological Association, and if you were in another country, they would have their own regulations as well, has established guidelines for both human and animal research, right? And so they're going to look a little bit different depending on what kind of research you're doing, but there's going to be guidelines that you have to follow, right? Now, generally speaking, the way that this is kind of enforced is that before any type of research begins, you need to file, right, basically a proposal. So you write out, what we're going to do. If I'm using something like mice or something, right, I need to say how many mice we're going to use, where we're going to get them from, right, what's going to exactly happen to them, right, how we're going to care for them, all that kind of stuff. Same thing with humans, right, what are we going to do, how are we going to pick those people, how are we going to make sure that they're okay, right? We write out this big proposal of what we're going to do, and then we submit it to some sort of ethics board, right? So like if I work at a university, there might be an ethics board at the university that does that. It might be what's called the Institutional Review Board, right? They can have that specifically for an institution, or it can be more kind of broad. But basically, we submit it to some group, right? And what they're going to do is they're going to go over it and make sure that there aren't any ethical violations. And then once they do that, they're going to basically say, yes, you can go ahead and carry out this research. If not, right, they're going to ask you to basically make changes before you're allowed to do anything. So there's basically kind of two groups of guidelines, right? One of them governs animal research, and one of them governs human research, okay? So animal research has kind of 6 main points that you have to follow, or 6 things that you have to do, right? So the first thing is that the research must have a clear and scientific purpose, right? You can't just do research just to do research. It can't be just because you want to see what happens. There has to be a real reason to do it. The second one is that the research must answer a specific, important scientific question, right? Now, again, you can kind of connect this to that first one. So there has to be a goal, right? You have to have a question that you're going to answer, and you need to be able to show that this is how we're going to answer it. The animals that you choose must be best suited to answer that question, right? So whatever animals you're going to use, if you are using animals, right, you need to prove that that's the best example, right? Now, generally speaking, most research we do is done on things like mice. That has a lot to do with, mice are really easy to care for, they grow really fast, they can have children and reproduce really quickly, so there's kind of benefits of doing that, but for certain kinds of research we might use something else, right? Sometimes we use, like rats are pretty common as well, just because they're a lot larger, and they have kind of like bigger brains and stuff like that if we need to work with those. But you need to show that whatever animal we want to use is chosen because they are the best choice, right? Because they're going to be able to be used most effectively for what we want. The researchers must care for and house the animals in a humane way, right? So there are specific guidelines that must be followed, right, to care for those animals and make sure that they have, a humane life. I know like at universities or at big kind of like research centers or institutes, right, they have whole, buildings sometimes that are specifically for keeping animals. Right, so they'll have different kinds of enclosures, right, depending on what kind of animals they are and what they need to be doing. But there's very specific regulations they have to follow, right? There's like certain amounts of like time of the day that like the lights are on versus the lights are off, right? Obviously, there's certain amounts of food and kinds of food or water, right? There's all these things that they have to be done to show that we're caring for these animals in a humane way. We also, so it says researchers must acquire animal subjects legally from accredited companies, right? Now this is really important. You can't just get your animals from anywhere you want, right? There are specific companies that are specifically allowed to sell you animals for research, right? And they obviously, breed those animals and raise those animals. If you're going to do some sort of like genetic research where there's going to be alterations done, right? Genetic alterations done, right? There's specific companies that do that, right, that are able to, go in and change that genome, right, to basically fit what you need to fit. So there's specific places you have to go from. if you are going to use wild animals, which sometimes does happen, although I would say it's probably not super common because obviously it's very challenging. But if you are going to use wild animals, they must be trapped in a humane way, right? So you must make sure that the way you are catching them is safe and you're not injuring them or harming them as you do that. And then lastly, researchers must design experimental procedures that employ the least amount of suffering feasible, right? So a lot of this is going to depend on kind of what you're doing, right? For some studies, you might be able to, run the test, and then, the animal can continue on with their life, and that's kind of it, right? For some other things, like maybe if I'm working with the brain, right, we may need the brain of that animal at the end, right? So the question might be, okay, if, we have to put this animal down, right, how are we going to do that in the way that's going to be the least amount of suffering, right? How are we going to do that as humanely as physically possible, right? And make sure that their life is as, good as it can possibly be. So again, those are kind of the general guidelines that are always going to be followed when it comes to animal research. When we look at human research, it's going to look a little bit different, right? There's kind of some specific terms that they're going to use, and there's obviously things that we can do with animals that we are not going to obviously do with human beings, right? So the first one is there cannot be coercion, right? So when it comes to studies, right, human beings must voluntarily participate, right? They have to be given the option, to be part of it or not. And if they choose not to be, they are allowed to leave, right? They're allowed to not be a part of that research, right? Now, in certain types of research, right, like there may be a little bit of, what's the word I want? Kind of like, I don't want, like manipulating a little bit, right? So there's certain ways that they can kind of like make sure, okay, we are still making sure that these people are consenting, right? They're still voluntarily being part of what we're going to do, right? Even if maybe there's a little bit of misinformation about what we're actually going to do, right? So there cannot be coercion. We cannot force people to be part of a study. There must also be informed consent. So that is where participants must know they are involved in research and give their consent, right? So again, you can kind of see that connection there between those two. So they have to participate voluntarily, but then they must also know that they are involved in research specifically, and they must give their consent to be part of that research, right? So like if you were going to be part of a study, there's a lot of times quite a bit of paperwork that you have to fill out ahead of time to say, yes, I'm voluntarily doing this. Yes, I am informed that this is going to be a research study. Yes, you have consent to take this information and use it and do all those other kind of things. In addition, we have to have anonymity and confidentiality. So what this basically means is that when the research is kind of concluded, as well as it's happening, participants must have their privacy protected, right? We cannot use real names in research, right? So when if someone carries out this giant research project and they write it all up, right, they cannot use people's real names in their publication, right? They have to use things like pseudonyms, right, where I like have, I shorten it down to initials, or I change their name to something completely different and just give them a fake name, basically. The idea is I need to protect those people, right? I cannot do research on someone or a group of people and then put their information out into the world. I need to protect that information and make sure that their stuff is safe. There's also risk that's involved. So we cannot place human beings under significant mental or physical risk. Right? Now, this one is a little bit subjective because the board has to kind of decide, what do we consider significant, right? What do we consider to be significant physical risk? What do we consider to be significant mental risk, right? Especially the mental one is pretty hard to define, right? Like, where do we draw that line that makes it significant that we cannot do it anymore? But basically, again, we need to protect people, right? So we can't do a psychological experiment that might leave someone with PTSD at the end. That's not going to be ethically okay, right? So there has to be kind of guidelines that make sure that we protect them. And then the last piece is debriefing, right? So debriefing is basically where after a study is completed, right, the participants in that study should be basically explained, they should be debriefed, right? And they should be explained what the study was about, what information we were collecting, right? What we maybe learned, depending on if we know that information or not. And they should also be a way for them to then contact those researchers later and get basically the results, right? And find out what happened. That's really, really important, especially because in a lot of times when we're doing like an experiment or something, we might not want people to know exactly what we're looking for, right? Because that could sway our results, right? If I tell you, I want to find out who has the best penmanship, well, then you're all going to try really hard to write really well, right? And you're going to take your time maybe. So I might not want to tell you exactly what I want. So debriefing can be really important with that idea of informed consent as well, is where, maybe you're part of a study, but I don't necessarily tell you exactly what we're looking at, right? And so at the debriefing part, we say, okay, here's what we were really looking at, here's what we really were studying, right? Here's what we found, and we're making sure that we kind of like wrap up all of this at the end. This was also really, really important for studies that may be considered kind of on that boundary, especially when it comes to risk, right? If we are kind of putting people in a situation that we could cause like maybe mental harm, we would really want to make sure that that debrief is really good to make it very clear, okay, hey, here's what we're doing, here's what we found, right? Here's maybe even resources if you need additional help or someone to talk to about what happened, right? Because we want to, again, make sure that, and this goes for humans and animals, right? At the end of the day, we want to make things as positive as possible, right? We want to make things not have negative effects on people's lives later on, okay? So that's our whole piece there for ethics. It's pretty simple, but again, you just kind of want to understand those different pieces and know, okay, how can I apply these different ideas of ethics to these different studies, all right? Please take some time and do a quick summary, and I'll see you next video.